This is episode 118 of That Shakespeare Life.
We have the famous advice from Hamlet to the players about suiting the action to the word and the word to the action. That seems to me to be a good way into thinking about how you need to fit words to a scenario. You fit words to a person, you fit words to an audience, and you fit words to your performance space.
Hi, I'm Susan Abernathy, historian at thefreelancehistorywriter.com. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
In the 16th century, as Shakespeare was writing plays like All's Well That Ends Well, Hamlet, and Julius Caesar, Shakespeare turned to classical philosophers and orators like Cicero and Isocrates to find tales exploring not only what constituted decent or proper behavior, but what happened to people when those invisible rules of decorum were altered or violated. Many of these stories were themselves designed for ancient theater performances and were as much emulated in their methods as they were harvested for their content when Shakespeare and his contemporaries adapted these classic stories for the 16th century stage. We've long lauded Shakespeare for what today seems like an application of a high level of education when the bard includes works of famous Latin and Greek poets in his stories. But as our guest this week is here to share, not only is Shakespeare not unique in his use of Roman, Greek, and Latin poets for the stage, but in the 16th century, we can see in the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, Jonson, and others that not only was turning to the past for your source material standard industry practice in Renaissance theater, but the culture of the audiences themselves would have considered the use of historically based metaphor in performances what Scott Newstok calls fitting to the times. Scott Newstok is the author of How to Think Like Shakespeare, and he joins us this week to explore his chapter of that book called Of Fit, where he explores the historical and cultural context of Shakespeare's plays, including the idea that for Shakespeare, precision with words, actions, and even costumes was as much a well-established professional standard as it was creative genius. Hello, Scott. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Cassidy. It's nice to be here.
Scott's chapter called Of Fit in his latest book, How to Think Like Shakespeare, refers to Cicero's writing as an explanation for fit, explaining, quote, "Nothing is more difficult than to see what is fit in both life and words," end quote. Scott, Cicero appears as a minor character in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Ben Jonson, wrote an entire play on Cicero. Was Cicero a popular person like a celebrity might be today for the 16th century?
Yes, Cicero has a wide range of influences in the 16th century. And going back even earlier, we think of the founding of the Renaissance as partly based on Petrarch's rediscovery of Cicero's letters and Petrarch's own letters that he wrote to Cicero. So in some ways, the ongoing centuries-long conversation with Cicero is something that's generated in Italy and then continued through Erasmus and through the 16th century in English Tudor humanist educational practices. So Cicero's admired as a philosopher, he's admired as a political theorist, as a kind of person who's thinking through what it means to have a republic, what civil wars entail. And then I think the thing that has the most direct influence on Shakespeare is Cicero's status as an orator, as someone who thought deeply about the power of speech and the necessity for the liberal arts to create a person who is adept at thinking through complex issues and speaking well about them. So the kind of overarching sense of something that unifies, I think, a lot of those strands of thought in Cicero is his sense of decorum, or another word that we would have for that would be fit. So the sense of doing the right thing at the right time, or being connected to the kinds of potentials for action in a particular circumstance. Fit is a very abstract notion, but I think we all can recognize when something has a good fit and when something has not quite so good a fit, whether that's in clothing or whether that's bad fit for a politician in a political seat, or architecture or a play, all kinds of different things we talk about in terms of having good fit or bad fit. And Cicero really is a magnificent thinker on what fit entails.
Several of these philosophers whose works came over from Italy weren't originally written in English, and one translator from Shakespeare's life, which helped bring the words of famous ancient philosophers to the English audience, was John Barry, who translated Isocrates just before Shakespeare's life in 1557. And when it did publish, it came out in tandem with another translator, Benedict Berg's version of Distichs of Cato. Cato was often turned into English theater well into the 18th century. Now, Scott, was it an industry-wide practice for Renaissance playwrights like William Shakespeare to turn to Greek and Roman stories as sources for theater?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in part that emerges out of their grammar school training, where they were reading Latin sources, Latin translations of Greek sources, and then later on often Greek sources as well, whether that was, again, letters, essays, political philosophy, drama. Those were an immense archive, an immense kind of trove of ideas and plots and characters and ways of thinking. Again, I think what ends up being less the direct influence, but a more powerful influence, is the influence of figures like Cato and his distichs as pedagogical influences. So those distichs are one of the longest standing Latin and then eventually translated into vernacular language textbooks for small children beginning their educational career. So they're dense, they're little 2-line units, they're giving you opportunities to think through basics of grammar, but they're also pushing a little kind of moral point or a sententious point. And you can see, I think, some of that, the traces of that influence in Shakespeare's couplets at the close of a scene, or when you have a sententious character like Polonius, who ends up sounding a lot like the distichs of Cato, or sounding a lot like some of the sayings of Isocrates, that in some ways Shakespeare's staging a kind of pedagogy, maybe a tired pedagogy, or a cataloging of truisms through the voice of a character like Polonius.
Excited to see more? Subscribe today at castycash.com/experience to watch this entire interview, bonus archaeological footage, and documentaries, and more, all about the life of William Shakespeare. I'll see you inside.